All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works? We take something complicated, break it down using the source material, and give you the need to know stuff. Like having a super smart friend explain everything without all the extra reading. Today, we're tackling the ideas of R.G. Collingwood.
Yep.
And for this one, we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on him as our guide.
Really fascinating guy. British philosopher,
Oh,
archaeologist.
right, he wasn't just a philosopher.
Yeah, lived from 1889 to 1943. And he's actually a really central figure in all these discussions about how we explain things,
Yeah.
especially in the social sciences versus the natural sciences. Like, there's this idea that all explanations should basically follow the same scientific method. People like Carl Hempel were big on that, but Collingwood was pushing back hard against that.
So not just digging up artifacts, but really digging into how we think about knowledge itself.
Exactly.
And I know he wrote a couple of pretty important books about all this.
Oh, absolutely. An essay on philosophical method, that was 1933, and then an essay on metaphysics in 1940. And these are considered really foundational in metaphilosophy, which is basically philosophy about philosophy, right? It's getting into the nuts and bolts of how philosophical inquiry actually works.
Perfect for you then.
Well, yeah, definitely in my wheelhouse. And Collingwood's work is still so relevant today for how we approach all sorts of intellectual disciplines.
So he was really trying to figure out what makes philosophical analysis unique, how it works differently from, say, scientific research.
Precisely. And his answers to that are, I think, still really important for us today, even outside of just academic philosophy. It gets into how we think about understanding and explanation in general.
Okay, so for this deep dive, since we're going deep into Collingwood for a philosophical audience and you are our resident philosophy expert, it's like we're talking directly to you. Where should we even start?
Good question. Well, one of the really distinctive things about Collingwood's early work is his idea of what he calls the overlap of classes. This might sound a bit technical, but it's actually super important. It challenges how we usually think about concepts in philosophy.
Overlap of classes. Okay, so break that down for me a little.
Sure. So Collingwood noticed that in philosophy, when we make distinctions between different ideas, those ideas often exist together, like in the same example. They're not neatly separated like you might see in biology, with animals and plants, or vertebrates and invertebrates.
Right, those are very distinct categories.
Exactly. But in philosophy, it's messier. Take ethics, for example. We can talk about an action being pleasant, expedient, and right, all different types of good.
Yeah, I can see that. Doing something nice for someone could be all those at the same time.
Exactly. If we followed the logic of biological classifications, then something pleasant would have to be not expedient and not right at the same time because the categories would have to be mutually exclusive.
Like they can't overlap.
Right. But that's obviously not how ethical concepts actually work. We use these ideas in much more complex ways. And Collingwood points out that this overlap isn't some rare exception, it's actually really common in philosophy. He says it's regular, and sometimes it can even be complete.
Okay, complete overlap. That's interesting. What does that even mean?
It means that, in theory, every instance of one concept within a category could also be an instance of another related concept in that same category. For example, every action that we consider expedient could, at the same time, also be something we consider a duty. The difference isn't in the actions themselves, but in how we're thinking about them, right? The way we're categorizing them.
So it's not like we're pointing to different things in the world, but using different mental frameworks to describe the same things.
Precisely. Collingwood argues these are distinctions without a difference in the actual instances themselves. The difference is in the concept, in how we understand and describe it. He calls them intentional distinctions, meaning they're about the meaning, the conceptual framework, rather than being extensional, which would be about identifying completely different groups of things in the real world. It's like the classic example of the morning star and the evening star. Same object, different ways of thinking about it. Philosophical concepts often work in a similar way.
Okay, that makes sense. So when philosophers are trying to figure out tricky concepts like love and jealousy, for example, it's not about sorting people into lovers or jealous people because someone can experience both of those emotions. It's about understanding those emotions as separate ideas with their own meanings, even if they happen to show up together in the same person.
Perfect example. And Collingwood was really insistent that this isn't just some abstract philosophical game. Understanding these intentional distinctions is super important if we want to avoid getting confused in our reasoning. Like, if we don't carefully separate the idea of good from the idea of self-interest, we might struggle to understand why doing the right thing sometimes means not doing what benefits us personally. Teasing apart those overlapping ideas, that's where philosophy really gets useful.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, so you mentioned that Collingwood also talked about how concepts can be both general, meaning they apply to lots of specific examples, and generic, meaning they group together different kinds of things. How does that work in his view?
Right, so traditional logic usually assumes there's a really neat relationship between those two aspects. Like if you have a big category that's divided into smaller, distinct subcategories, then each individual example would fit neatly into just one of those subcategories. But Collingwood argued that philosophy doesn't work that way.
Because of the overlap.
Exactly. Because of the overlap, we can't assume that kind of clean hierarchical structure. Philosophical distinctions are more nuanced, so the same example might actually fit into multiple conceptual boxes at the same time.
This is reminding me of his work on the mind-body problem, which is another topic that's always fascinated philosophers. Did he apply this idea of overlapping classes to that as well?
Oh, absolutely. It's central to his whole approach there. He argues that the mind and body aren't actually different things in some ultimate metaphysical sense, but rather they're two different ways of knowing the same thing. When we use the methods of natural science, we see a human being as a physical body, right? Subject to physical laws.
Okay.
But when we use reflection, when we look inward at our thoughts, intentions, reasons, then we understand ourselves as minds.
So, same human being, but different ways of understanding that human being.
Exactly. And Collingwood really stresses that this is a philosophical distinction. It's about how we approach understanding, not some metaphysical statement about the universe being made of mind stuff or something like that. This is key to why we have different kinds of explanations for things. Like actions are explained by reasons, intentions, purposes, stuff that relates to the mind, while events are explained through descriptions of laws, the kind of things science discovers.
Right, makes sense.
This really foreshadows his later work on the philosophy of history, too, the idea that understanding history, understanding human actions, requires a different type of explanation than we use for natural phenomena.
Oh, right, like a volcanic eruption versus the French Revolution.
Exactly. And one last point about Collingwood's early thinking on philosophy. He was very clear that we can't verify philosophical concepts in the same way that scientists verify things. We can't go out and empirically measure mind or goodness or justice the way you can measure the mass of a rock or the speed of light.
But he still thought those concepts were important and valuable.
Oh, definitely. He said their value lies in giving us these different, sometimes overlapping descriptions of reality. They help us understand things in richer, more nuanced ways, and that ultimately leads to better thinking.
Okay, so that was a great overview of Collingwood's early thinking, particularly this idea of the overlap of classes. But our outline also mentions something called presuppositional analysis as a big concept in his later work.
Right, yes. So in an essay on metaphysics, we see this big shift in Collingwood's thinking. He moves toward the idea that philosophy's main job is to uncover the fundamental presuppositions that underlie all our thinking. So it's not just about the relationships between concepts anymore, but about these even deeper assumptions we make before we even start thinking about concepts.
Okay, presuppositions. So are we talking about the assumptions we make before we even ask a question?
Precisely, like the things we take for granted without even realizing it. He's really careful to separate this from what he calls propositions, which are the statements that answer questions. Propositions can be true or false, right?
Makes sense.
But presuppositions are different. They're what make the question itself possible. Like imagine I ask you, where did you buy that book?
Okay.
Well, that question presupposes you even bought a book in the first place. If you didn't, the question just doesn't make sense. And the presupposition itself, the idea that you bought a book, isn't true or false. It's just the background assumption that the whole question relies on.
Yeah. It's like the foundation the question is built on. This reminds me a bit of Kant and his ideas about the conditions necessary for knowledge.
Oh, there are definitely some parallels there,
Yeah.
for sure. And Collingwood actually takes this further by introducing this idea of absolute presupposition.
Absolute presuppositions. Huh?
These are like the deepest, most basic assumptions that we need in order to have any system of knowledge or practice. We don't even question them, because questioning them would undermine the whole system.
Can you give me an example of what he meant by that?
His most famous example is the different ways we use the word cause. He identifies 3 distinct senses of cause. Sense I is the kind of cause we talk about in history and philosophy of mind. It refers to a reason or a motive, like, why did she go to the store? Because she needed milk. That's a reason, a logical ground for an action.
Right.
Then there's sense two, which is really important in practical sciences like engineering or medicine. The sense of cause is about an antecedent condition, something you can manipulate to get a desired result. Like a doctor might say the cause of your illness is a bacterial infection. That's something they can treat to make you better.
Okay, so it's a cause we can do something about.
Exactly. And finally, there's sense third, the kind of cause we usually see in physics. This is an unconditional antecedent event, meaning if A happens, then B must happen, regardless of whether we can do anything about it. Like, if I drop this pen, it will fall to the floor because of gravity.
Gotcha. So those are three very different ways of thinking about what a cause is.
Right. And Collingwood says these different senses of cause actually function as absolute presuppositions in their respective fields. A doctor has to presuppose that illnesses have causes that can be treated. That's like the foundation of medicine. If you start questioning that, the whole system falls apart. And it's
Yeah.
important to note, these aren't the kind of assumptions you can just test and revise like a scientific hypothesis. They're deeper than that.
So this idea that different fields are based on different fundamental assumptions, it naturally leads to what we call explanatory pluralism. Don't-
Exactly. Because if different fields are built on these different unquestionable assumptions, then their explanations for things aren't necessarily in conflict. They might be answering different kinds of questions based on those different starting points. Collingwood uses this really nice example of a car stopping on a hill. A physicist might explain it by talking about gravity and friction, right, using that sense third kind of cause. But a mechanic might explain it by saying there's a problem with the fuel line that's a sense to cause, something you can fix. Both explanations are valid, but they're addressing different aspects of the situation based on those underlying presuppositions.
So the physicist is explaining why the car can't move, and the mechanic is explaining why the car won't move.
Precisely. And they're both right. The problem only comes when we try to mix and match these different types of explanations without realizing they're coming from different frameworks. And Collingwood saw this as a big job for philosophy to untangle these conceptual knots, as he called them, to show us the connections between these assumptions, the questions they allow us to ask, and the types of answers we should expect.
This is really interesting. It's like philosophy becomes this map maker of knowledge, showing us the different terrains and how they connect.
That's a great way to put it. And this whole focus on analyzing presuppositions is what leads to Collingwood's idea of metaphysics without ontology.
Okay, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it sounds a bit intimidating, but the idea is this. If all our knowledge comes from these presuppositions, and these presuppositions aren't like facts about the world, then there's no such thing as knowledge without presuppositions. We can't just look at the world as it is with no assumptions. So there can't be this direct access to some pure being or ultimate reality like traditional metaphysics has always tried to find. For Collingwood, metaphysics becomes about studying these presuppositions, not about some ultimate reality beyond them.
So it's a different way of thinking about metaphysics altogether.
Exactly. And it changes how he approaches some classic philosophical problems, like take the problem of induction. Hume famously argued that we can't actually prove the future will be like the past. That's the principle of the uniformity of nature. And Hume said it's not a matter of fact and it's not a necessary truth, so we can't rationally justify believing in it.
Right, classic Hume.
Right. But Collingwood says this principle isn't a proposition at all. It's an absolute presupposition that underlies all of science. So asking if it's true or how we can verify it, that question just doesn't make sense because it's not the kind of statement that can be true or false. It's just assumed by the scientific method itself.
It's like the rule of the game, not a move within the game.
Precisely. By shifting the focus from truth to the structure of our thinking, Collingwood gives us this whole new way to approach these old philosophical puzzles.
Okay, so that's presuppositional analysis in a nutshell. But our outline also mentioned something called the radical conversion hypothesis in Collingwood scholarship.
Right, yes. This is a debate among scholars about whether Collingwood's whole understanding of philosophy changed drastically later in his career.
Like he had a philosophical conversion.
Well, the radical conversion hypothesis suggests that in his later work, after an essay on metaphysics, Collingwood basically made philosophy all about history. He stopped trying to solve philosophical problems and just focused on describing how people thought in the past.
So instead of trying to get philosophy right, he was just documenting how people got it wrong.
That's the basic idea. People who support this view point to passages in an essay on metaphysics where Collingwood says things like, metaphysics is the attempt to find out what absolute presuppositions have been made by this or that person or group of persons on this or that occasion or group of occasions. Sounds pretty historical, right?
Yeah, that's not about solving philosophical issues. That's about recording past beliefs. But I'm guessing there's a counter-argument to this radical conversion view.
Oh, definitely. Lots of scholars say Collingwood's project was more unified. They point to his consistent focus on explanatory pluralism, which we talked about earlier, the idea that different fields have their own valid ways of explaining things based on their different presuppositions. These scholars say his work on history isn't about saying all beliefs are equally good. It's about showing how historical inquiry has its own unique presuppositions that make it different from science.
Okay, so it's a debate about how much Collingwood changed his mind, whether he became more of a historian than a philosopher in his later work.
Exactly. And most scholars nowadays lean towards seeing more continuity in his thinking.
Okay, now Collingwood wrote about the ontological argument for the existence of God. That's like classic hardcore metaphysics, right? And given his whole metaphysics without ontology thing, it seems weird that he'd even bother with it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case. In his earlier essay on philosophical method, he actually defends the ontological argument. But it's a very strange defense, not the traditional one at all.
So what was he doing with it if he wasn't trying to prove God exists?
Well, Collingwood thought the ontological argument, when interpreted the right way, actually shows us what philosophical analysis is all about. He even said in a letter to Gilbert Ryle, another philosopher, that God is that which we are thinking about when we are thinking philosophically.
That's a pretty cryptic statement.
Yeah, it's definitely Collingwood being Collingwood, but what he means is that philosophical concepts aren't like physical objects. They don't exist in the world in that way.
Okay.
They exist in the judgments and inferences we make. So the argument isn't about proving some being exists, it's about showing the inherent structure of philosophical thought.
Can you give me a concrete example of that?
hmm
How a concept like good or mind exists in the judgments we make?
Sure. Take the concept of good. When we're thinking about what to do, we often use if-then statements. If I want to achieve X, then I should do Y. Well, that X, the thing we're trying to achieve, that's often something we consider good. So the concept of good is kind of built into the structure of that kind of reasoning. It's not about some separate thing called goodness out there. It's about how we think and make decisions.
Okay, I'm starting to see what he's getting at. So with the mind, would it be the same kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. When we explain someone's actions by talking about their reasons and beliefs, we're already assuming that minds exist and that they have some kind of causal power. The concept of mind is just built into that type of explanation. So for Collingwood, the ontological argument isn't really proving anything about the external world. It's more like a reflection on how philosophical thinking itself works.
Interesting. And this interpretation got him into a back and forth with Gilbert Ryle.
Oh, yeah. They had quite the exchange going. Ryle, who was very much into logical analysis, didn't like Collingwood's take on the ontological argument at all. He argued that there are no statements that are both absolutely true and about the existence of something. Collingwood pushed back, saying there's a third kind of proposition, one that's not just a matter of definition or empirical observation, but is still necessary. These are philosophical propositions.
And these propositions, they're where concepts like mind and matter live.
Right. And they're necessary because these concepts are built into the practices of science and other ways of knowing the world. The concept of mind is necessary because we need it to explain actions in terms of reasons, and the concept of matter is necessary for understanding the physical world through science.
So the heart of their disagreement wasn't really about God, but about whether philosophy has its own unique kind of truth, distinct from science or logic.
Precisely. And Collingwood was really fighting to establish a clear space for philosophy, one that wasn't just swallowed up by science or lost in abstract metaphysical speculation.
It sounds like he was struggling to make his ideas clear within a philosophical landscape that was rapidly changing.
Oh, absolutely. And even though he really tried to make his position clear, people like Ryle still misunderstood him. Their debate about the ontological argument shows just how difficult it was for Collingwood to get his ideas across to the analytic philosophers who were becoming more and more influential.
Okay, so now let's talk about what our outline calls his metaphilosophical battle with A.J. Ayer. This sounds like a much more direct confrontation with the rising tide of analytic philosophy.
It was. By the time Collingwood wrote an essay on metaphysics, he was dealing with the full force of logical positivism, and Ayer was one of its strongest proponents. Remember that Ayer's book, Language, Truth, and Logic, had laid out the verifiability principle of meaning, which was a major challenge to traditional metaphysics.
Right. Ayer basically said if a statement can't be verified by experience or logic, it's meaningless. Tough crowd.
Yeah, pretty much. And this was a big problem for metaphysics, which had always dealt with concepts that couldn't be observed directly. Collingwood's answer to Ayer was that he was missing a whole layer of meaning. Ayer was only focused on statements that could be true or false, what Collingwood called propositions. But he completely missed these deeper assumptions, the presuppositions that made the whole system of knowledge possible.
Okay, so remind me again, how did Collingwood see those absolute presuppositions fitting into this debate? They didn't seem to fit Ayer's categories of truth or meaningfulness.
Exactly. Absolute presuppositions aren't the kind of things that science can investigate, and they're not just logical truths either. They're at a deeper level, shaping the very possibility of empirical or logical inquiry. So Ayer's verifiability principle just couldn't handle them. Collingwood was essentially saying that the logical positivists were so focused on proving things true or false that they missed this whole other dimension of meaning, the assumptions that make thinking itself possible.
So he wasn't just defending metaphysics, he was trying to show that logical positivism was missing a huge part of the picture.
Exactly. He was arguing that philosophy had a crucial role to play in uncovering these hidden assumptions, these presuppositions that shaped all our knowledge and practice.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, Collingwood is often labeled a British idealist. How did he feel about that label?
He was pretty wary of it. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry points out that he even explicitly rejected that label in a letter to Gilbert Ryle. While he was definitely influenced by some aspects of British idealism, he didn't want to be put in that box. He did experiment with a form of objective idealism in some of his earlier lectures, but he always resisted these strict philosophical labels.
Why was he so hesitant about the British idealist label? What were the main differences there?
Well, a lot of people associate idealism with the idea that reality is fundamentally mental or spiritual. And while Collingwood did criticize realism, his arguments weren't really about saying that the world is just made of ideas.
Okay.
His main issue, especially in his later work, was with this idea of presuppositionless knowledge. The Oxford realists, people like Cook Wilson and Pritchard, they thought we could know things without any prior assumptions, and that's what Collingwood really attacked.
So it's not that he denied an external reality, but he thought all our knowledge of that reality was shaped by our existing assumptions and frameworks.
Exactly. For Collingwood, all knowledge is about answering questions, and questions always come from presuppositions. So the idea of knowing something with absolutely no assumptions, that just didn't make sense to him. It's kind of like Kant, but even more radical. Kant thought our minds shaped our experience, but Collingwood went further and said the very idea of knowledge without any shaping is just incoherent.
Interesting. So he wasn't a straight-up idealist, but he definitely wasn't a traditional realist either.
Exactly. Okay, so now let's move on to his work on history.
Okay.
In books like The Idea of History and The Principles of History, Collingwood takes his idea of presuppositional analysis and applies it to the study of the past. His big question is, what are the absolute presuppositions that make historical understanding possible? What does it mean to understand history, not as science or something else?
So he wasn't just concerned with the mechanics of how we know about the past, but with the bigger question of what history actually is.
Right. He's interested in the specific presuppositions that make history unique. And he argues that the historical past, the past as it's understood by historians, is not the same thing as the past studied by, say, a geologist. It's a past that's shaped by a specific set of concepts and assumptions that are different from those used in the natural sciences. The questions historians ask, the kinds of answers they're looking for, all of that comes from those unique presuppositions.
Can you unpack that a bit? What are some of those key differences between how historians and scientists approach the past?
Well, one big difference is this idea of the uniformity of nature. We talked about how that's fundamental to science, allowing them to make predictions based on laws. But Collingwood says historians are more interested in what makes each historical period unique, not in finding universal laws that apply to everything.
So, for a historian, the fact that ancient Egyptians had totally different beliefs and practices than we do today, that's actually really important.
Exactly. And trying to force those beliefs into some kind of universal scientific framework could actually distort our understanding. He was really critical of people who dismiss historical accounts just because they seem improbable based on what we know about science today.
Like people who say miracles can't happen because they violate the laws of physics.
Right, exactly. Collingwood says the historian's job isn't to judge whether those accounts are true or false, but to understand what they meant to the people who believed them. He famously said, the important question is not whether it is true or false, but what it means.
So for Collingwood, the real work of history is getting inside the minds of people from the past, understanding their world on their own terms.
Precisely. To understand a historical action, you have to go beyond just the facts of what happened. You have to understand the thoughts, the intentions, the social and cultural context that gave that action meaning. And this is where his distinction between the outside and the inside of an event comes in.
Right, the outside being the observable facts and the inside being the thoughts and motivations behind them.
Yes. And Collingwood says history is about understanding actions, which are the unity of both of those, not just events, which only have an outside. To understand actions, the historian has to engage in what he calls reenactment, which is basically trying to rethink the thoughts of the people who lived in the past.
That's a powerful image.
It is, and it connects back to his earlier work on the mind. Just like actions in the present are explained by reasons and intentions, historical understanding requires us to grasp those same things about people in the past. And this leads to his famous and often misunderstood concept of reenactment.
Right, let's dig into that. What did he mean by that exactly? Did he literally think historians could time travel into the minds of historical figures?
Well, not exactly. He clarified that it's the thought itself that's reenacted, the logical content, the meaning, not the actual psychological act of thinking, with all the feelings and sensations that go along with it. So, if a historian understands the steps in a mathematical proof, they're thinking the same thought, logically speaking, as the mathematician who originally came up with it.
Okay, so it's not about mystical mind melding. It's about grasping the logical and rational structure of past thinking.
Exactly. It's about understanding the problems they faced, the way they reasoned through things, the assumptions they made.
But hasn't he been criticized for focusing too much on thought and ignoring other factors that might have influenced history, like emotions or irrationality?
Oh, yes, some people have said that. They accuse him of over-rationalizing history, but Collingwood's response would probably be that he's not saying historians should ignore those things. He's just emphasizing the importance of understanding how people in the past thought, how their actions made sense to them.
So it's not that he thinks everything in history was driven by logic, but he's saying that to understand history, we have to understand the logic that the people were using at the time.
Precisely. And this leads to a really interesting implication of his view. If reenactment is possible, then it means that the past, in principle, is knowable to us. We can understand how people in the past thought, even if we don't agree with their conclusions. This is a pretty different view than what some later philosophers argued. People like Gadamer and some of the narrative theorists, they emphasized how our own present-day perspectives always shape our understanding of the past. Collingwood was much more optimistic about our ability to really get inside the minds of people who lived in different times.
Fascinating. Okay, so last but not least, let's talk about Collingwood's argument against methodological unity. This brings us back to his rejection of the idea that all knowledge should be pursued using the same scientific method.
Right, he was very against that idea. Thinkers like John Stuart Mill and later Carl Hempel, they thought that ultimately there's only one way to do science, and it applies to both the natural world and to human beings. But Collingwood thought history was fundamentally different from science.
So it's not just that studying humans is more complicated than studying rocks. It's a completely different kind of investigation.
Exactly. He actually criticized what he called the pseudoscience of thought, which was basically psychology trying to act like physics. He thought they were missing the whole point of what it means to have a mind, to act for reasons, to have intentions. The difference between history and science isn't about what's inside our heads versus what's outside. It's about two completely different ways of understanding the world.
Okay, and this is where the work of W.H. Dre comes in, right? He helped revive some of Collingwood's ideas in these debates
Yeah.
about the philosophy of history.
Yes. Dre really drew on Collingwood's distinction between actions and events and his concept of reenactment to argue against Hempel's famous covering law model.
And that model said that all explanations, including historical explanations, have to rely on general laws.
Right. But Dre, following Collingwood, said that historical explanations are different. They're about showing why an action made sense to the person who did it, not about finding some universal law that predicted it.
It seems like Collingwood had a huge impact on how we think about history and the social sciences, but the Stanford Encyclopedia entry mentions that his influence declined later in the 20th century. Any idea why that happened?
Yeah, it's interesting. The entry suggests that part of it was just a shift in philosophical interests. Metaphysics came back in a big way, and Collingwood's whole approach to metaphysics was very different.
Right, he was trying to move beyond those traditional debates.
Exactly. And in the philosophy of history, the focus shifted more towards questions about how we know about the past, the reliability of historical sources, things like that. Collingwood was more concerned with defining what history actually is, what makes it unique.
So even though his ideas were really important, the conversation just moved on to other topics.
That seems to be what happened. But the entry concludes by saying that Collingwood's big project was really about defending this idea of explanatory pluralism, the idea that there are different valid ways of explaining things, not just one scientific method that rules everything. And that's a really important insight that's still relevant today.
Okay, so that was a deep dive into the complex world of R.G. Collingwood. To sum up for our listeners, he was all about clarifying what makes philosophical thinking unique, how it differs from science and history. He emphasized how these underlying assumptions, these presuppositions, shape all our knowledge. And he argued that history is a distinct discipline with its own special way of understanding the past.
Exactly. He gave us a whole new way to think about the different kinds of knowledge we have and how they all fit together.
So for our listeners out there who are into philosophy, how does Collingwood's work resonate with you? Does it challenge your own assumptions about how knowledge works or how we understand history?
If you're really interested in digging deeper, I highly recommend checking out his books, An Essay on Philosophical Method, An Essay on Metaphysics, and The Idea of History. They can be a bit tough going, but they're packed with brilliant insights.
And his focus on understanding the inside of actions, the reason behind why people do what they do, that's something we can all apply in our own lives, trying to understand the different perspectives and motivations we encounter every day.
Absolutely. Collingwood gives us these tools for critical thinking that go way beyond academia. They can help us make sense of the world around us.
That's what the deep dive is all about, helping you grapple with these big ideas and come away with a deeper understanding.
And maybe even questioning some of your own assumptions along the way.
Thanks for joining us.